In the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its boiling point. The Allies were bombing German industry day and night, but the cost was unbearable. Entire bomber formations vanished in fire and smoke, torn apart by the Luftwaffe's deadly fighters. One mission, on a bright April morning, was supposed to be routine. Another deep strike into the heart of Germany. But within minutes, everything went wrong. What followed would become one of the most remarkable reversals in the air war. When a single American pilot, surrounded, outgunned, and nearly out of fuel, turned a failing mission into the Luftwaffe's worst day. The target was Regensburg, a key center for German aircraft production. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-51 Mustang escorts thundered across the channel in perfect formation. But somewhere over Belgium, chaos erupted. Flak bursts tore through the lead elements, scattering the bombers. Radio interference jammed communications. Then from the clouds, the Luftwaffe descended. Squadrons of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving at full speed. The mission commander, Colonel Donald Blakesley, realized what was happening too late. The escorting Mustangs were spread too thin, the bombers too exposed. The Germans had planned their ambush perfectly. Within minutes, formation after formation was burning, the sky littered with falling debris and parachutes. And then one pilot, Captain Robert Bob Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, made a decision that would change everything. His orders were clear: break off, regroup, and return to England. The bombers were already doomed, and his own P-47 Thunderbolt had been hit by flak. But Johnson refused. He throttled up, turned back toward the smoke, and dove straight into the fight. What he saw below was hell itself. Dozens of burning aircraft, crippled bombers drifting apart, and German fighters circling like wolves. The Luftwaffe was winning, and Johnson knew that if someone didn't hold the line, the entire mission would collapse. With his radio half dead and instruments flickering, Johnson began picking off German fighters one by one. He flew low, fast, reckless, breaking formation, weaving through enemy attacks, and diving through the chaos to protect crippled bombers. His Thunderbolt, already leaking oil, became a blur of motion and noise. He shot down 2 Messerschmitts in minutes, then turned his guns on a third, flames bursting from its engine as it spiraled downward. But the Germans kept coming. For every plane he downed, 3 more seemed to take its place. Still, Johnson didn't retreat. He couldn't. Behind him, the bombers were still over German territory, and without cover, they were doomed. That was when Johnson spotted it. The turning point. A formation of German fighters was regrouping to attack the remaining bombers from above. If they struck, none would make it home. Johnson climbed, his damaged P-47 groaning, its propeller screaming in the thin air. He lined up his guns on the lead aircraft, took aim, and fired. The German formation scattered. What followed next would become legend. One man against a swarm. Captain Robert Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt clawed upward into the sun, its engine trailing smoke, its wings trembling from damage. Below him, the battle raged. Hundreds of aircraft locked in deadly motion across a sky littered with fire and debris. His mission was no longer about victory. It was about survival and defiance. As he rose through the haze, Johnson saw the German formation reforming. They flew in tight, perfect discipline, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, climbing for another pass on the crippled bombers below. Each pilot in that formation had likely downed dozens of Allied planes. They were the elite, veterans of years of combat. Johnson leveled off just above them, cut his throttle, and let gravity carry him into a dive. The Thunderbolt screamed downward. At 400 miles per hour, he opened fire. His 8.50 caliber Browning guns spat fire and thunder. Tracers sliced through the air, tearing into the lead Focke-Wulf's engine. It burst into flame instantly. Johnson pulled hard to the right, rolling through the chaos as the remaining Germans scattered. They hadn't seen him coming. One pilot against an entire squadron had just thrown them into confusion. But confusion turned quickly to fury. Within seconds, the Luftwaffe regrouped, 10 aircraft now turning toward him. Johnson gunned his engine and began a deadly dance in the clouds. His Thunderbolt wasn't nimble like the P-51 Mustang, but it could take punishment and dish it out. The first Messerschmitt came in head-on. Johnson didn't flinch. He fired a long burst, watched the tracer rounds walk up the German's fuselage, and then rolled away as the fighter exploded. Another dove from above, Johnson yanked the stick, and the Thunderbolt climbed sharply, heavy but responsive, its engine roaring in protest. Every move was a gamble. His ammunition was running low, his oxygen nearly gone, and his instruments unreliable. But every second he bought meant more bombers could escape. He weaved through the dogfight like a man possessed, the massive fighter shuddering from hits. Holes appeared in his wings. A fuel line burst, spraying vapor into the cockpit. Still, Johnson kept fighting. The Germans could not understand how this single American plane, half crippled and alone, refused to fall. One German pilot broke radio silence to warn the others. "A thunderbolt below the clouds. Do not engage head-on." They thought he must be part of a larger group. He wasn't. By now, the air around Johnson was emptying. The German fighters had broken off to regroup. His Thunderbolt drifted over the burning countryside, smoke pouring from the engine cowling. Below him, he could see the wreckage of fallen bombers, black columns of fire marking the places where men had died. He was alive, but barely. The battle was far from over. The Luftwaffe would return, and he was almost out of ammunition. Then through the static, his radio crackled. A weak voice from a bomber group still trying to escape. They were being pursued. The Luftwaffe was coming again. Johnson took a deep breath, adjusted his seat harness, and turned his crippled aircraft back toward the fight. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of fuel. But he wasn't done yet. Captain Robert Johnson knew he should have turned back. His P-47 was bleeding fuel, its control surfaces sluggish, its body riddled with bullet holes. Any other pilot might have withdrawn to safety. But he wasn't thinking about safety. He was thinking about the bombers. Below him, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses struggled homeward. They were limping, many missing engines, leaving trails of smoke that marked them for death. And behind them, dark specks on the horizon. German fighters, moving fast. The Luftwaffe was coming to finish what they'd started. Johnson's Thunderbolt roared as he dove to intercept. His altimeter spun wildly, his controls shuddered. The dive alone could tear his aircraft apart, but the risk didn't matter. At that moment, he wasn't just a pilot. He was a wall between death and the men flying those bombers. As he leveled out, the Germans were already firing. Their tracers streaked across the sky, slicing into the wounded formation. One B-17 caught fire and fell away, its crew parachuting into the abyss. Another staggered, still holding formation. Johnson squeezed his trigger. His last round spat from the guns. The lead Messerschmitt burst into smoke and dove away. Then, nothing. The guns clicked empty. He was out of ammunition. For most, that would have been the end. But Johnson didn't turn back. Instead, he climbed again, flying directly into the swarm of enemy fighters, hoping to draw their attention. And it worked. The Luftwaffe pilots, believing this single American was still armed, turned to attack him. Johnson jinked and rolled, forcing them to follow. The bombers slipped away one by one into the cloud cover, saved by the reckless courage of a lone man in a dying machine. But now the Germans knew the truth. His guns were silent. One Focke-Wulf 190 closed in, firing short bursts. Bullets tore into Johnson's fuselage, shattering glass, ripping fabric, punching through the armor behind his seat. Smoke filled the cockpit, but still, the P-47 refused to die. Johnson pushed his nose down, diving again through the cloud layer. The Germans followed, but the Thunderbolt was built for dives like this. Its heavy frame, its powerful engine, could take forces that would tear lighter aircraft apart. The enemy pilots pulled up first. Johnson kept going. At 400 miles per hour, he leveled off just above the trees. His vision blurred, his body screamed from the G-forces. But he was alive, and still flying west. For miles, no one pursued. The radio was dead, his compass unreliable. The world outside was just endless fields and wreckage. He didn't know if he'd make it back. But he did know one thing. Today, dozens of airmen would. Back at base, the bomber crews reported seeing a single Thunderbolt hold off an entire German wing. They didn't know who it was or how he survived, only that he had. As Johnson limped home through the smoke and haze, the sky behind him burned with the remnants of battle. It was supposed to be a failure, another mission lost to the Luftwaffe's supremacy. Instead, it became the day the Germans realized the Americans wouldn't break. When Robert Johnson's Thunderbolt touched down that evening, it looked more like wreckage than a warplane. The mechanics who ran toward it froze in disbelief. The fuselage was shredded by cannon shells, the canopy peppered with holes, and the tail nearly severed. They counted more than 200 bullet impacts, and yet somehow it had flown home. As Johnson climbed out, he was pale, his flight suit torn, his face streaked with oil and blood. He hadn't just survived the Luftwaffe, he had humiliated them. The ground crew gathered around the P-47, tracing the damage with trembling hands. They had never seen anything like it. One mechanic said, "It looks like someone flew a sieve." Another pointed to a cannon shell that had lodged itself in the armor plate, undetonated. The aircraft had been hit so many times that even its control cables were frayed, and yet the Thunderbolt's rugged design, its radial engine, its armor, its redundant systems, had saved him. Word spread quickly through the airfield. Pilots who had doubted the P-47 now looked at it with new eyes. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything at it and failed. But the true impact wasn't just in one man's survival. The mission that was supposed to end in disaster had turned into a revelation. Allied commanders realized that when flown with aggression and belief in its endurance, the Thunderbolt could challenge even the feared Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109. From that day on, bomber escort tactics began to change. Pilots learned to dive, to draw enemy fighters away, to use the P-47's speed and toughness as both weapon and shield. For the Luftwaffe, this was the beginning of doubt. They had spent years believing in their dominance of the sky, a legacy built by aces like Galland, Hartmann, and Barkhorn. But that dominance was slipping. Every battle, every sortie now demanded more fuel, more aircraft, and more lives. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning, adapting faster than anyone thought possible. Reports from German intelligence later noted the incident. They couldn't understand how a single American fighter had endured such punishment. To them, it wasn't just skill, it was a symbol of industrial power. For every Thunderbolt shot down, 2 more arrived. For every pilot lost, 10 more trained replacements filled the ranks. The Luftwaffe's aces were outnumbered, their machines overworked, their fuel scarce. By the summer of 1944, the balance had shifted. The Americans no longer feared the skies over Europe. They owned them. For Robert Johnson, the mission was just one story in a war full of chaos. But for the Luftwaffe, it was a warning that even a mission doomed to fail could turn into a nightmare for those who underestimated American resolve. That day, the skies over Europe belonged to one man and one machine. By mid-1943, the Thunderbolt had become the backbone of the U.S. 8th Air Force's escort missions. But to the Germans, it was still a mystery. They had heard of the plane that could take punishment and keep flying. The flying jug, they called it mockingly. Yet every time they engaged it, they found themselves outmatched in ways they didn't expect. German pilots relied on agility and altitude. Their Bf-10-9s and FW-19s could climb faster, turn tighter, and hit harder, at least on paper. But what they hadn't prepared for was the brute force of American engineering. The P-47 could dive faster than anything in the Luftwaffe arsenal. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns could shred even the toughest German aircraft in seconds. And when the fight turned desperate, the Jug could simply dive away, leaving its pursuers struggling not to tear their wings apart. German air intelligence began to take notice. After the Johnson incident, several reports were sent to Berlin. They described the P-47 as heavy but invincible, mechanically simple but operationally superior. One even compared it to a flying tank. The Luftwaffe's engineers were stunned. They had spent years perfecting machines like the Focke-Wulf 190, masterpieces of design and precision. But the Americans were building weapons for war, not art. The P-47 was rugged, standardized, and mass-produced. It didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be unstoppable. And it was. When the German pilots faced thunderbolts in large formations, the effect was devastating. The P-47s flew in disciplined groups, their guns synchronized, their tactics coordinated. The Luftwaffe's advantage in experience began to fade as attrition took its toll. The aces who had once ruled the sky now fought for survival. Each engagement cost them aircraft they couldn't replace and pilots they couldn't afford to lose. Meanwhile, new waves of American fighters kept arriving, fresh, fearless, and equipped with better tactics every week. By autumn, the skies over Europe had begun to change color, from the dark crosses of the Luftwaffe to the white stars of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The mission that Johnson had survived became a rallying legend. It was told in airfields and barracks across England. The story of the man who brought a shredded plane home, the man who proved that courage and engineering could defy the odds. The Luftwaffe, listening from across the channel, dismissed it as propaganda. But deep down, their pilots knew the truth. If a P-47 could survive that, then the air war was already changing. In the months to come, the Germans would discover something even more terrifying than the Thunderbolt. The next generation of American air power, faster, stronger, and now guided by the lessons of that near-fatal mission. The sky had become a proving ground, and in that crucible, one pilot's near death had become the blueprint for victory. In the months following the mission that turned the tide, the Americans began to refine how they fought in the air. Every lesson written in blood was studied, analyzed, and turned into doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces realized that the key to breaking the Luftwaffe wasn't just producing more planes, it was producing smarter pilots and better coordinated formations. The P-47 Thunderbolt became the cornerstone of that strategy. Engineers back in the United States modified it for range, adding drop tanks and improving engine efficiency. What had once been a short-range interceptor now became a deep penetration escort. With every upgrade, the Germans' defensive advantage shrank. Meanwhile, on the German side, disbelief turned into alarm. Reports from the front described growing losses among fighter units. Commanders noted that even when damaged, Thunderbolts returned to fight again within days, while German aircraft, once downed or crippled, were often lost forever. The industrial difference was staggering. In 1943, the Americans were producing over 2,000 aircraft a month. The Luftwaffe couldn't match even a quarter of that. And while Allied factories ran around the clock, many German plants were bombed, relocated, or crippled by shortages. The Thunderbolt symbolized this imbalance. Every time one took off from an English airfield, it carried with it not just firepower, but the weight of an entire industrial empire behind it. German engineers who studied down P-47s were astonished. The aircraft systems were simple, modular, and built for rapid replacement. A damaged wing or fuselage section could be swapped in hours, not days. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, powerful, reliable, and easy to maintain, could take incredible punishment and still perform. What stunned the Germans most was how industrial efficiency had been turned into a weapon. While they handcrafted machines with meticulous precision, the Americans built fleets. And unlike the fragile elegance of German designs, the P-47 was built like an anvil that could fly. By the end of 1943, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane, it was a statement. Its success in combat marked the beginning of the end for Luftwaffe dominance. German pilots who once dove confidently into dogfights began to hesitate. The arrogance of 1940 was gone, replaced by quiet realism. They had underestimated the Americans, not just their pilots, but their capacity to learn, adapt, and outproduce. The skies over Europe were no longer safe for the Luftwaffe. The hunters had become the hunted, and as thunderbolts streaked across the sky, their silver wings glinting in the sun, they carried with them a silent truth. The balance of air power had shifted forever. By early 1944, the transformation of the air war was complete. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked as too heavy and too slow, had proven itself a predator. Armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns and capable of diving faster than any German fighter, it became a nightmare for Luftwaffe pilots. The American escort strategy evolved rapidly. No longer tied tightly to the bombers, Thunderbolt pilots began to roam freely ahead of the formations, hunting the hunters. They ambushed enemy interceptors as they climbed, catching Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs before they could even reach the bombers. The Germans called it Freie Jagd, free hunting, but now the hunters were American. The impact on German morale was devastating. For years, Luftwaffe pilots had been the masters of the sky, veterans who viewed Allied planes as clumsy, uncoordinated targets. But now that arrogance vanished. Reports from squadrons over France and Germany described dogfights where P-47s dove from high altitude at impossible speeds, their heavy guns ripping apart German formations in seconds. Even the famed Focke-Wulf 190, once considered untouchable, could not escape. The Thunderbolt's sheer mass meant it could dive faster and longer, and when it pulled out, the German planes often tore their wings apart trying to follow. One Luftwaffe veteran would later write, "It was like fighting a flying hammer. You hit it, but it hit back harder." But it wasn't only skill or technology that decided the outcome, it was endurance. The Americans could afford to lose planes, the Germans could not. Each new P-47 that rolled off an assembly line replaced a lost one within days. For the Luftwaffe, every loss was irreplaceable. Another hole in a shrinking force. The numbers told the story. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had lost more than half of its experienced fighter pilots. Training programs were shortened, and new recruits were sent into battle with barely 100 flight hours, against seasoned Americans with twice the experience. For the Germans, the most terrifying moment came when the P-47 began striking targets on the ground. With its rugged airframe and incredible dive speed, it became one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. Columns of tanks, trains, and convoys that once moved safely under Luftwaffe cover were suddenly shredded from above. Pilots called these missions rat runs, strafing German forces retreating from Normandy to the Rhine. The Thunderbolt became the sound of inevitability, the roar that followed defeat. By now, even the German high command knew the truth. The Luftwaffe was broken. The Americans had not only won the war of machines, but the war of adaptation. And through it all, the P-47, the Jug, as its pilots called it, had become the symbol of that victory. By the summer of 1944, the sky above Europe belonged to the Allies. Every day from dawn to dusk, waves of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs roared across the continent. Their mission was simple: total air supremacy, and they achieved it with relentless precision. The German High Command, once confident in its Luftwaffe, was now desperate. Fuel shortages crippled pilot training, aircraft maintenance collapsed, and radar stations were bombed daily. What once had been an elite air force was now fighting on fumes. The Thunderbolt squadrons pressed this advantage mercilessly. Their pilots flew low over occupied France, strafing transport columns, railway junctions, and airfields. Every day the Germans lost not just planes, but the lifelines that sustained their war. On the ground, German soldiers began to dread the sight, or even the sound, of the P-47. Its engine, a deep, mechanical growl from its massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, could be heard miles away. To Allied troops, that sound was hope. To the Germans, it was death from above. The Thunderbolt's 8 Browning machine guns could shred armored vehicles, trains, and even small bunkers. When rockets were added later in 1944, it became one of the most devastating close support weapons of the war. German tank crews, already terrified of Allied artillery, now faced destruction from the sky itself. But behind every mission, there was risk. The P-47's pilots fought brutal odds. Anti-aircraft fire was constant, and the skies were filled with debris and smoke. Even a single flak burst could rip through the fuselage or tear away control surfaces. Yet the Thunderbolt's design, its rugged frame, radial engine, and thick armor, saved countless lives. Reports from returning pilots told of aircraft returning to base with wings shredded, holes large enough to crawl through, and engines leaking oil, yet still flying. One squadron commander later said, "If you wanted to get home alive, you wanted to be in a Jug." In captured German reports, Luftwaffe officers admitted their growing fear of the Thunderbolt. They called it der Panzerjäger aus der Luft, the tank hunter from the sky. Its combination of speed, firepower, and survivability was unmatched. To German pilots who once laughed at its bulk, it had become a symbol of everything they could no longer match: production, endurance, and willpower. By autumn, even the Luftwaffe's elite Jagdgeschwader groups could no longer stem the tide. Every dogfight drained precious fuel and irreplaceable pilots. The Allies, in contrast, only grew stronger. For every Thunderbolt lost, two more took its place. For every German ace that fell, the skies grew quieter, until silence itself became a sign of defeat. The laughter that had once filled Luftwaffe airfields, the arrogance that once mocked Allied machines, had turned to silence. The Germans had built fighters for brilliance, the Americans had built them for endurance. And in the end, endurance had won. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. What had once been the pride of Europe's skies, a force that had terrorized London, crushed Poland, and ravaged France, now struggled to defend its own airspace. The Americans ruled the skies, and leading the charge were two aircraft that had changed the course of air warfare: the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. To German pilots, the humiliation was complete. Once they had laughed at the Americans, mocking their planes as lumbering machines of the masses. Now they watched helplessly as those same machines swept across the continent in endless formations. Day after day, American fighters escorted bombers deep into the heart of Germany. The once untouchable industrial centers, Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, burned beneath waves of high explosives. And whenever the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept, the P-51s were waiting. The Mustangs, sleek and graceful, could outclimb and outfight almost anything the Germans had left. The Thunderbolt, heavy and unyielding, tore apart trains, tanks, and convoys with brutal efficiency. Together, they turned the skies into a killing ground. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's remaining pilots realized they were not just fighting superior machines, they were fighting a superior system. Germany's aircraft factories were in ruins. Fuel was rationed to a few liters per sortie. Training programs were rushed. Some pilots had less than 20 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. Meanwhile, American pilots rotated through rest periods, had reliable supplies, and flew planes built faster than Germany could replace losses. Every destroyed Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf meant months of recovery that Germany no longer had. By February, Allied reconnaissance reported that many Luftwaffe airfields were empty. The war had moved beyond Germany's ability to fight it. German engineers and officers began keeping secret reports, quietly acknowledging the inevitable. Some described the P-51 as the final evolution of fighter design. Others called the Thunderbolt a flying hammer that broke the spine of our war effort. Even Goering, once the boastful commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." On the ground, civilians looked up in disbelief. The American fighters flew unchallenged over cities that had once been heavily defended. To many, the roar of their engines was the sound of the Reich collapsing. And for the few surviving German aces, that sound carried a bitter truth: that the arrogance which once filled their ranks had been replaced by silence and resignation. In those final months, the Luftwaffe's best could only delay the inevitable. The skies they had once dominated now belonged to the enemy. The Americans had achieved what the Germans thought impossible: absolute control of the air. And beneath those endless silver wings, the Third Reich began to crumble. By April 1945, the air war over Europe was no longer a contest. It was an annihilation. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was shattered. Its hangars stood empty, its fuel stores dry, and its aces scattered or dead. Above the ruins, the skies belonged entirely to the Allies. The Americans had achieved the impossible. Through sheer industrial power, relentless training, and tactical innovation, they had built an air armada that crushed the German war machine from above. And at the center of that armada were the fighters the Germans once mocked: the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt. For the German pilots who survived, the shock of defeat went beyond the loss itself. It was the realization that the enemy had done what they could not: adapt, evolve, and outproduce. While German engineers obsessed over perfection, the Americans mastered efficiency. They built planes faster than they could be destroyed and trained pilots faster than Germany could bury its dead. Many Luftwaffe veterans later admitted that they had underestimated the United States. They had seen it as a nation of factories, not fighters, a place of mechanics, not warriors. But in the end, it was those mechanics who built the machines that brought the Reich to its knees. In post-war interrogations, captured German officers spoke with disbelief. They described their awe at the scale of American industry, the endless convoys of aircraft, the spare parts stacked higher than buildings, the unbroken rhythm of production. One general simply said, "We could shoot down 100 planes a day, and by morning they would replace them." The Luftwaffe had never stood a chance. By the time Berlin fell, the once proud German pilots no longer spoke of glory or victory. They spoke of exhaustion, of endless missions flown on dwindling fuel, of new recruits who died on their first day, of a sky filled not with hope, but with fire. And in that fire, the myth of German air supremacy was burned away forever. History would remember the Mustang and the Thunderbolt not just as machines of war, but as symbols of a nation's resolve, proof that innovation and determination could triumph over arrogance and tyranny. For the German pilots who had once laughed at the Americans, the skies themselves became the final teacher. They had believed they could never be beaten, but the roar of the P-51 over Berlin told a different story, one written in smoke, courage, and the fall of an empire. The war in the air was over. The age of the Luftwaffe was gone, and the sky, that vast and merciless battlefield, now belonged to those who had earned it through sacrifice and steel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.